Have you ever trusted someone so much that you believed nothing, absolutely nothing, could shake that trust, and suddenly the ground disappeared from under your feet? My name is Mary Johnson. I'm 57 years old, and today I'm going to open my heart in a way many people might not have the courage to do. What I'm going to share isn't just a tale of pain, but a true story of betrayal, abandonment, judgment, and silencing, all within the faith that has always been the center of my life. I grew up believing that marriage was a sacred, indestructible covenant. The church taught me to wait on God, to care for my family, to remain steadfast even when life got tough. I believed my faith would protect me from any storm, but no one prepared me for the kind of storm that was about to engulf me. Because the truth is, sometimes the blow doesn't come from outside. It comes from within. It comes from those you love most, those you never imagined distrusting. Warning, this revelation will leave you speechless. I've always been very close to my sister. She was my confidant, the person I ran to confide in, the one I thought would always be there for me. But it was precisely in this intimate and sacred space that my life was ripped apart. Has anyone else here experienced this? Have you ever felt the pain of being replaced by someone who should have had your back? I remember feeling like I couldn't breathe, like my whole world had ended. How could it be possible within my own family, within my own faith, to be ripped from the place that was mine? I struggled with feelings I wouldn't wish on anyone: humiliation, shame, anger, and even the feeling that God had abandoned me. Trust me, the ending is worth it, because in the midst of darkness, something happened that forever changed the way I see life, faith, and even myself. And that's exactly what I'm going to share with you now. From a young age, I believed that faith was like an invisible shield, capable of protecting me from all of life's pain and risks. I grew up in church, hearing sermons about promises, miracles, and restoration. I was always told that if I remained faithful, if I honored God with my life, then He would take care of me and my family. This idea became the foundation of my mindset. I dreamed of a solid home, built on the rock, as the scriptures say. And when I met the man who would become my husband, I was certain that this dream was about to come true. It was as if all my prayers had been answered at once. I remember the sparkle in my eyes, the sense of security, the certainty that I had found my journey partner. I trusted so much, believed so much, that it never occurred to me that one day this foundation might crumble. The promise of faith, for me, was an unbreakable covenant. If I remained obedient, then my family would be protected. This truth seemed absolute. Marriage became my most important ministry. Every gesture, every care, every prayer was offered as part of a greater purpose. I believed I was living behind the scenes of a divine plan, and that with discipline and surrender, I would reap the fruits of peace and happiness. But little by little, subtle signs began to emerge, almost imperceptible. A word uttered, an awkward silence, glances that lingered a little longer than they should. Still, I clung to the promise. My decision was to trust, to believe that this was part of a process, that every relationship faces trials. Today, I realize there was a hidden truth I didn't want to see, that faith isn't a contract that guarantees no one will hurt us. Faith is the strength to face when someone inevitably hurts us. This revelation changed everything within me, because I understood that pain wasn't proof of divine abandonment, but part of a journey of transformation I never would have chosen alone. It felt like I was in a silent struggle, where on one side was my devotion, and on the other, the harsh reality of life. I tried not to show it, but inside, the impact was already beginning to take hold. It was like carrying an invisible weight, smiling on the outside and bleeding on the inside. I wondered if my decisions had been right, if my dedication had been in vain. But there is something even more essential here, something that few realize. I've always viewed marriage as a sacred covenant, a pact that went far beyond a simple contract signed before witnesses. To me, it was as if God Himself had placed His hands upon us and sealed that commitment with an eternal seal. I believed with all my heart that nothing could break this union, because it wasn't just between a man and a woman, but also between us and the Creator. This mindset gave me security, made me believe I was shielded from any threat. I remember the day I got married, the feeling of entering a new journey full of promise. I looked into his eyes and felt like I had found my safe haven. It was as if every prayer I had prayed for years had been answered all at once. The blessing I received at that altar became my shield against the fear of the future. I kept repeating to myself, "This is the man God chose. This is my place. This is my family." And indeed, in the early years, it seemed like everything fell into place. There was affection, complicity, and a routine that, in my eyes, was proof that we were being sustained from above. I believed that, even in the face of difficulties, that foundation would never be shaken. If there were frictions, I understood them as normal phases. If there were occasional distances, I saw them as part of the learning process. It never occurred to me that there was something bigger moving behind the scenes, something that would later reveal a hidden truth that would completely change the way I viewed marriage. This conviction that my marriage was indestructible led me to make important decisions. I set aside some personal dreams to invest everything in my family because I believed that was where my calling lay. I gave myself body and soul, and each sacrifice was made with the certainty that I was cultivating fertile ground, a divine purpose. The impact of this choice was profound because it shaped my identity, making me believe that I was, above all, a wife and mother. I didn't see weakness in that, only strength. Over time, I realized that this absolute trust also left me vulnerable. I wasn't prepared to deal with the possibility of serious failures because I simply didn't believe something like that could happen. And when small signs began to emerge, I chose to ignore them. I told myself that everything was a test, that every relationship goes through phases of testing. This resistance mindset, which seemed so spiritual, actually blinded me to something that was already happening before my eyes. I didn't know that the seemingly solid foundation was beginning to show cracks. There were subtle details, changes in behavior, emotional distances that I insisted on bridging with faith and prayer. And so, while I clung to the promise of an unbreakable alliance, what was really happening behind the scenes of my life was something I never dared imagine. I didn't know it, but while I insisted on believing my married life was built on indestructible rock, small cracks were opening beneath my feet. And before I knew it, they weren't just cracks anymore. They were an abyss growing silently, hidden behind the scenes of my own home. This is the painful part of the hidden truth. It disguises itself, hides behind smiles, routines, seemingly innocent phrases. And when the revelation arrives, the impact is devastating. I chose to share all of this because I know I'm not alone. Many women, perhaps even you watching me now, have found themselves in similar situations, struggling to hold on to something that seemed to be falling apart in their hands. And it's precisely because I recognize this pain that I decided to open my heart in this way. If this topic resonates with you, leave your thoughts in the comments below because your voice matters. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. Each subscription isn't just a number. It's a sign that this message is finding space, that these stories aren't being told in vain. When you subscribe, you become part of a community that believes in the power of storytelling, the courage to expose wounds, and the possibility of transformation. I say this sincerely. It's the unity of each person who follows, comments, and shares that keeps this mission alive, bringing hope, reflection, and encouragement to so many other women who need to hear that they are not alone. This is how we continue this journey together, with the courage to face difficult revelations and still find the strength to carry on. And as I relived these memories, realizing how attached I was to the idea of an indestructible alliance, a new reality began to impose itself before me, bringing questions I never thought I would have to face. My sister has always been my rock, the person I thought I knew inside and out. She was younger, but I kind of saw her as my best friend. We grew up together, sharing secrets, confidences, and dreams. When the weight of adulthood began to weigh me down, she was the one I ran to, because there was a nearly unbreakable bond between us. Behind the scenes of my story, she was that constant presence, the voice that calmed me, the companion that reminded me I wasn't alone. I truly believed that God had given me not just a blood sister, but a journey partner, someone who would walk beside me through every stage of life. It was natural to open my heart to her. I talked about my marital struggles, my worries, even my deepest insecurities. I saw no problem in exposing every detail because the trust was so strong that the possibility of an ulterior motive never even crossed my mind. It was like handing someone a diary and believing they would never use those words against you. This trust was absolute, and I didn't realize that, while sharing my vulnerabilities, I was also leaving gaps open that would later have an unimaginable impact. I invited her into my home, not just as a visitor, but as part of our routine. She often joined our family conversations, Sunday lunches, and prayers together. My mindset was that the closer the family was, the stronger we would be in the face of challenges. And since I believed my marriage was solid, I saw her presence as a reinforcement, never as a threat. For me, it was a source of gratitude to have this union, almost like a perfect portrait of harmony. Today I understand that life is made of decisions, and each one carries a silent weight. The decision to trust blindly was my own, fueled by the belief that a sister's love could never turn into something hurtful. I had no idea of the hidden truth that was slowly forming, like a shadow growing unnoticed. What strikes me most when I look back is how naturally everything happened. There was nothing explicit, nothing that would make me suspicious. On the contrary, the gestures of care and closeness reinforced my certainty that we were all moving in sync. It was as if we were building a solid, flawless story, and I was proud of that. However, within that same narrative, signs began to emerge that I preferred to ignore. Because, after all, when you trust someone so much, your own mind refuses to accept that anything could be wrong. And it was precisely this trust, so pure and naive, that opened the way for a sequence of revelations that would radically change not only the way I saw my marriage, but also the way I understood loyalty, the behind-the-scenes nature of family, and even the limits of the human heart. At first, everything seemed so normal that I could never have imagined what was about to happen. The first signs arrived subtly, almost imperceptibly, like small cracks in a wall that still seems solid. They were so subtle that anyone who wasn't paying attention would consider them insignificant. And I, driven by trust and love, made a point of justifying every detail. I remember moments when my husband would suddenly go silent when I entered the room. I'd ask if everything was okay, and he'd smile, saying it was just work fatigue. And I believed him, because my mindset was shaped to always see the best in the people I loved. It was the same with my sister. She sometimes showed more interest in talking to him than to me, and I interpreted this as a connection, as if it were something positive. After all, what a blessing it would be to have such a close-knit family, right? There were times when she would jokingly comment on what a dedicated man he was, or how lucky I was to find him, and instead of finding it strange, I would smile proudly, believing it was simply a sign of affection and admiration. I didn't realize that, behind that lightheartedness, there was something going on behind the scenes that escaped my comprehension. The impact of these small actions only became clear much later, when everything came to light. But at that moment, my mind refused to see anything that could tarnish the image I had built. I was quick to justify it. If he arrived late, it was traffic. If she showed up more dressed up for family gatherings, it was just vanity. If the two shared discreet glances, it was my imagination. This was the hidden truth. I was feeding a narrative that protected me from pain, even if it meant living in illusion. Today I understand that every decision I made to ignore those signs was like putting a bandage on a wound that hadn't yet been exposed. I didn't want to see, I didn't want to feel, I didn't want to believe. And this mindset, while giving me temporary peace, only prolonged the inevitable. Because the more I closed my eyes, the more space I gave that situation to silently grow. It was as if I were walking on a brightly lit road, but unaware that, just steps away, there was a dark bend ready to reveal a scene that would completely change my journey. And it was precisely at this bend that my life began to take a turn I had never anticipated, a path marked by painful revelations and profound transformations that would test even my most intimate faith. I grew up hearing that the church was a place of welcome, a safe space where every tear would find solace and every pain would be treated with compassion. But when the signs began to unsettle me, I realized there was a silent mentality looming over everything. The idea that certain topics shouldn't be spoken aloud. When I sought guidance, the advice I heard most often was, pray and endure in silence. It was as if talking about what was bothering me would open a dangerous door, something that could tarnish the image of my family, my husband, even my faith itself. This imposed silence weighed heavily. I began to feel guilty simply for thinking about sharing my anguish. If I said too much, I risked being seen as an ungrateful, unsubmissive wife, so I kept quiet. I swallowed the pain, put on my best smile, and went about my daily routine as if nothing were happening. I prayed for clarity, for a sign, but the only answer that seemed to come was the echo of my own voice within a void. This emptiness, however, was not the absence of God, but rather the reflection of a culture that taught me that suffering in silence was more virtuous than exposing the hidden truth. Deep down, I believed that if I remained steadfast, enduring without question, everything would eventually become a testimony. This hope kept me going, but it also blinded me. The impact of this silence was devastating because it isolated me even further. I stopped talking to friends and loved ones, fearing judgment. And the more I remained silent, the more room there was for the situation to evolve behind the scenes of my own life. Today, I can see how this mindset reinforced the naivete with which I treated the first signs. I believed I was acting in faith, but in practice, I was becoming hostage to a narrative that prevented me from confronting reality. This silence ate away at me. I would come home after services carrying a huge weight on my chest because I didn't have the courage to tell anyone that something was wrong. The facade was intact, but inside I was in turmoil. The most painful thing was realizing how the very words I'd been taught since childhood about patience, submission, and endurance could be distorted in such a way that they kept me trapped in an unjust situation. And while I convinced myself that remaining silent was the right decision, something much greater was being constructed behind my back, about to be revealed in ways I could never have imagined. I'll never forget the day the truth came out. It's strange how moments like these are etched in our memories with an almost cruel clarity. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those where routine seems to repeat the same actions. Preparing dinner, tidying the house, waiting for my husband, who, as always, was late from work. I was already accustomed to this kind of excuse, and I even tried hard not to let anxiety overcome me. But that night, something told me something was different. A strange restlessness invaded me, a chill that came not from outside, but from within. It was then that the signals connected, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been avoiding putting together. The silences, the looks, the apologies, everything began to make sense. And what had previously been mere suspicion now became a brutal revelation. I discovered this wasn't just any betrayal. It was my sister, the woman I trusted, the friend, the confidant, the one with access to the behind the scenes of my life. She had not only gotten too close, but had taken the place that should have been mine alone, the place of wife, of companion, of part of a pact that, for me, was sacred. The scene was like a punch in the gut. Confirmation came in the most painful way, evidence that could no longer be ignored. That moment not only brought pain, it also profoundly impacted my mentality. Suddenly, everything I believed about fidelity, family, and loyalty shattered before my eyes. It was as if my life had been split into two parts. Before the revelation and after, there was no room for denial. It was my sister, the same one who had prayed with me so often, who had cried on my shoulder, who knew every detail of my struggles. And now, she was in bed with my husband. The wound wasn't just in my heart, it was in my soul. I felt naked, exposed, betrayed on every possible level. What hurt most was not just the loss of a marriage, but the loss of the purest trust I had built throughout my journey. In that instant, so many things raced through my mind. Quick decisions, confused thoughts, the urge to scream, to confront, to simply disappear. I wished it were a lie, but the hidden truth was already before me, naked and raw, and there was no turning back. The impact was so great that I felt like my own body wouldn't obey me, as if I'd been ripped from within myself. And it was exactly at that point, in the devastating shock of the revelation, that something began to break completely inside me, beginning a new phase of my story, marked by scars, but also by a transformation that I still couldn't understand. The shock was so great that, for a few moments, it felt like my body had shut down. I could hear my breathing quicken, but I couldn't believe this was happening to me. It was as if I were watching the scene from the outside, as if it were another woman's story, not my own. The mind refuses to accept it when the pain is unbearable. It's as if there were a defense mechanism trying to convince me that it was all a misunderstanding, that I was exaggerating, that somehow there was a logical explanation. But the more I tried to rationalize, the clearer it became that the truth was staring me in the face. The disbelief was paralyzing. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I wanted to cry, but even the tears seemed trapped. It was a mixture of anger, sadness, and at the same time, a kind of emptiness I can't describe in simple words. How could I deal with the fact that the same bed where I had so often bent my knees in prayer was now the scene of my greatest humiliation? How could I believe that the sister I trusted blindly had become an accomplice to my greatest trauma? In that moment, all my references crumbled. The love I believed was eternal, the family I thought was united, the faith that kept me going. Everything became jumbled in a whirlwind of emotions. I remembered the promises made at the altar, the conversations I'd had with my sister, the nights I'd poured out my insecurities to her, and all of that now felt like cruel irony. My mind kept repeating, "It's not possible. This can't be real." It was as if there were an invisible barrier between what I saw and what I accepted. The feeling of betrayal mixed with shock so intensely that I didn't know where to begin. It was a profound impact, affecting not only my heart, but also my identity, my worldview, my sense of worth. Nothing seemed to make sense. I walked around the house, and every corner seemed to carry a memory that was now tarnished. What had once been the scene of happy moments now became proof of a farce that had been constructed behind the scenes without my realizing it. I wanted answers, but at the same time, I was afraid of them. I wanted to confront them, but I also wanted to run away. I wanted to wake up from a nightmare, but I was trapped in reality. And it was precisely in this state of disbelief that my journey took an even more painful turn, because from that point on, I would have to face not only the betrayal itself, but also all the devastating consequences it would bring to my life. After the initial shock came the cruelest blow, abandonment. I still harbored an irrational hope that he would regret it, that it was all just a passing mistake, something that could be repaired, but it wasn't. His decision was clear, direct, and cold. He not only betrayed me, but he chose to remain in that betrayal. My husband didn't want to come home, didn't want to fight for us, didn't want to try to rebuild anything. He simply left, and the most devastating thing wasn't just his departure, but the choice of who he took with him, my own sister. The feeling of being replaced within my own family is something I can't describe in simple words. It's as if my existence lost its value in a matter of seconds. I looked in the mirror and asked myself, what did I do wrong? What does she have that I don't? At what point did I stop being enough? These questions echoed in my mind like a daily torment. The psychological impact was devastating because it wasn't just a marital loss, it was also a loss of identity. I was no longer a wife, no longer a confidant, no longer the chosen one. I was the discarded one. The void that opened up inside me seemed endless. Watching my sister take the place that was once mine was like watching a cruel movie in which I no longer had a role. I saw a dark transformation taking place behind the scenes of my own story, and no matter how hard I tried to understand, nothing made sense. How could someone so close, from within my own home, make the decision to hurt me so deeply? How could the man who promised to love and protect me simply replace me as if it were something trivial? I felt as if I'd been expelled from my own life, my home, my family, the faith that sustained me. Everything seemed tarnished, and suddenly I found myself alone, surrounded by silences that screamed louder than any words. It was in this abandonment that disbelief gave way to the rawest pain, the realization that I had been replaced not by a stranger, but by the person I most believed I knew and loved. And it was precisely in this scenario of loss and emptiness that something began to move within me, a mixture of revolt and the need to survive, which would gradually lead me to a new journey marked by even more painful revelations. The abandonment was painful enough, but what came after was a weight I never imagined I'd carry. I discovered that the pain came not only from betrayal, but also from the judgment of others. Suddenly, my story was no longer just mine and became the talk of hallways, whispers behind doors, and looks that pierced me like blades. People who once hugged me in services now looked away or gave me expressions of pity, as if I'd failed at something that should have been perfect. What shocked me most was realizing that, within the Christian community where I expected acceptance, I often encountered disapproval. Some said in pious tones that perhaps I hadn't prayed enough. Others insinuated that I could have been a more attentive, submissive, and dedicated wife. It was as if the blame had been placed on my shoulders, as if I were responsible for the collapse of what I had fought so hard to preserve. The hidden truth is that when a woman is betrayed, there remains a mentality that seeks justification in her behavior, rather than looking at the decisions of the one who truly erred. I felt judged in every detail. If I appeared sad, they said I lacked faith. If I appeared smiling, they insinuated I'd moved on too quickly. There was no room to simply be human. This pressure gnawed at me from within, because in addition to the pain of abandonment, I had to deal with the feeling of being constantly watched, as if my every move were being evaluated by an invisible audience. The impact of this on my journey was devastating because it further isolated me. I avoided meetings, avoided answering questions, even avoided places that had previously been a source of joy because I could no longer bear the judgmental stares. Behind the scenes of my mind, a silent battle raged. I fought shame, the fear of being seen as the woman who failed, when in reality I knew it wasn't me who had broken that alliance. But it was difficult to hold this truth alone, when so many external voices pressured me to believe I could have done something different. This internal conflict consumed me, leaving me exhausted. And it was precisely at this point of fragility, surrounded by veiled accusations and suffocating loneliness, that I began to realize how the journey of healing depends not only on what happens to us, but also on how we deal with the voices that try to imprison us. Because more than the betrayal itself, the judgment of others also leaves deep scars that take time to heal. Shame became my silent companion. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal or the weight of abandonment, but the suffocating need to hide it all behind a forced smile. At church, where everyone believed I was an example of a strong woman in faith, I wore a mask. I sang hymns with a choked voice, while inside I felt as if I were shattered into 1,000 pieces. I struggled to appear strong, to show that I remained confident in God's promises, but the hidden truth was that each service was a battleground between what I showed on the outside and what I lived on the inside. I remember moments when tears would insistently fall during collective prayers, and I'd quickly wipe them away so no one would notice. The impact of the previous trial had taught me that showing weakness would only open the door to more accusations, more disapproving looks. So, even carrying an open wound, I forced myself to pretend I was okay. This bearing in silence mentality became almost a uniform I wore every day. I'd smile at people, tell them I was at peace, but then I'd go home and cry until I couldn't hold back. It was as if I lived two versions of myself. The public version, seemingly resilient, which claimed to trust in God's plans and kept holding its head high, and the private version, fragile, tired, and almost hopeless. This contrast exhausted me. Every Sunday at church became an exercise in acting, an effort to maintain an image that didn't correspond to reality. And the more I hid, the more distant I felt from myself. The hardest part was dealing with the feeling that God wasn't listening to me. I prayed for comfort, asking for a sign, but silence seemed to be the only answer. This only increased my shame, because I wondered if, deep down, I wasn't even failing in my faith. It was an invisible prison. I couldn't show weakness to people, but I also didn't feel strong enough to pour myself out before God. And so, day after day, I grew accustomed to carrying this false armor, hiding tears behind firm gazes, disguising pain with pretty words. until this accumulated weight began to become unbearable, and I realized I couldn't live forever maintaining an appearance that didn't match what I truly felt. It was at that point that something inside me began to crack again, paving the way for even deeper revelations. What hurt me most, after all, was realizing that even my own voice had been ripped from me. When I finally summoned the courage to seek help within the church, believing I would find a safe space to express my pain, I was met with words that still resonate with me. Don't talk about it. It's best to leave it in God's hands. It was as if sharing the truth were a mistake, as if putting into words what I was experiencing was an affront to faith. The leaders, to whom I trusted my heart and sought as a spiritual guide, asked me to endure in silence, to avoid arousing suspicion, to avoid exposing what was happening. The message was clear. Keeping up appearances was more important than facing reality. I felt as if I had become some kind of threat to the community's own testimony. Betrayal and abandonment weren't treated as their sins, but my desire to speak out, to expose the hidden truth, was seen almost as my own. It was as if I were carrying a responsibility that never belonged to me. And in the process, my pain was silenced once again. This imposed silence had a devastating impact on my mentality. I wondered if it really wouldn't be better to remain silent, if my voice truly had no value, if my role was simply to move forward with silent faith, without questioning, without revealing. But deep down, something inside me screamed that a huge injustice was being committed. I was being treated as an accomplice to what was destroying me. Behind the scenes, my life was falling apart, and yet I was asked to smile in public, to maintain the image of a family that no longer existed. This imposition compounded the shame I already carried. It wasn't enough to face abandonment, the judgment of others, and the open wound of betrayal. Now I also had to deal with the feeling of being trapped in a narrative that wouldn't allow me to be true. With every service, every meeting, every veiled conversation, I felt my own story being ripped from me. I was forbidden to say what had happened to me, as if the simple act of speaking out were a greater wrong than the sin committed against me. And it was in this silence that I began to realize that the weight came not only from what they did to me, but also from what they prevented me from doing. They prevented me from fully existing. The pain grew deeper because besides being betrayed, I was silenced. And this mixture of wound and silence was what led me to an even more intense darkness, where I would begin to face the darkest night of my soul. The silence imposed on me hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. It was as if my story had been kidnapped, and I no longer had the right to put it into words. And in that burden, I discovered something even crueler. When a woman can't speak, the pain grows silently within her. Perhaps that's why I chose to share it here, because I know there are many others going through the same thing, choking back tears and forcing smiles, unable to reveal the depths of their pain. If this topic resonates with you, leave your comment below with what touched you most, because your voice matters too, and when you speak out, other women realize they are not alone. And if this story is already touching your heart in some way, I ask you for one simple but very important thing. Like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but the truth is that every like shows that this content has an impact, that it needs to reach more people going through similar journeys. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, helping to spread hope and transformation to those who may today lack the strength to even believe that there is a way out. Because deep down, this isn't just my story. It's a silent cry for so many others who have been silenced and who need a space to recognize themselves, to strengthen themselves. And it was in this scenario, where my voice seemed worthless and my heart bled in secret, that I ended up entering the darkest phase of my journey, the one in which the night seemed endless and even God seemed distant. There was a time when I thought I'd lived through the worst, but I soon realized that pain still had deeper paths to take me. After being betrayed, abandoned, and silenced, came a time when even my faith seemed to have fallen silent. I would go into my room, close the door, and kneel, but the words wouldn't come out as they once had. The prayer that had once been full of hope was now just a stifled whisper, a suppressed cry that barely reached my own ears. I asked God to give me an answer, to show me a sign, anything to remind me He was still with me. But the sky seemed bronze, and silence was the only answer I received. It was in this silence that darkness enveloped me completely. I felt abandoned not only by the man who promised to be by my side, not only by the sister who stole what was mine, not only by the community that judged me. I felt abandoned even by God. It was as if I had been left alone in a barren desert, without strength, without direction, and without any solace. This was the darkest night of my soul, the moment when even life seemed to have no meaning. There were days when the urge to give up was real, when getting out of bed was a superhuman effort, when looking to the future felt like torture. I walked like someone carrying tons of weight on my shoulders, trying to appear normal on the outside, but inside, I was begging for a reason to keep going. My mind filled with confusing thoughts, and I wondered if there was any point in continuing. The pain had taken over so much that even breathing felt too heavy. The impact of this period was so strong that it transformed me completely. I was no longer the same woman who believed in unbreakable promises. I was a wreck, someone who barely recognized herself in the mirror. This dark journey led me to confront truths I had never imagined. The greatest of these was realizing that faith does not exempt us from traversing deep valleys, and that often God's silence does not mean absence, but a painful space where we learn to deal with our own fragility. Yet, at that time, all I could feel was emptiness. And it was precisely in this emptiness, on this border between giving up or continuing, that something unexpected began to unfold within me, paving the way for a revelation that would change the course of my journey. It was in the depths of this suffocating silence that something began to stir within me. I no longer had the strength to cry out. My prayers were only tears, but it was precisely at this point of exhaustion that an unexpected understanding began to dawn. It was as if, little by little, a very subtle light broke through the darkness, not loudly, but subtly, almost imperceptibly, and this revelation transformed my mindset. I realized that God had never abandoned me. The absence I felt wasn't from Him. It was the void left by the choices of those who used their free will to hurt. God hadn't written that painful script for me. He hadn't planned for my husband and sister to break my trust, nor for me to be judged or silenced. What happened was the result of human decisions, of hearts that chose paths far from what I believed to be sacred. This hidden truth, though hard to accept, brought me unexpected clarity. The pain wasn't proof of divine rejection. It was the result of the freedom each of us carries, which can be used for both love and destruction. The impact of this realization was profound. It was as if I finally had access to the backstage of my own story. For months, I had believed I was alone, that even heaven had turned its face against me. But when I understood that God was still there, even in silence, I felt I wasn't the target of punishment, but rather someone experiencing the consequences of others' choices. And this changed the way I saw myself. I stopped seeing myself as rejected by God and began to see myself as sustained by Him, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. This encounter with truth was a turning point. I no longer needed to wonder if there was something wrong with me, if my faith wasn't enough, if I hadn't prayed enough. The revelation showed me that God's love wasn't in question. What was at stake was the human heart, and the human heart, as we all know, is capable of great acts of love, but also of choices that deeply hurt. This transformation in how I saw the situation didn't erase the pain, but it gave me the strength to breathe again. It was as if, within the darkest night, I'd seen a ray of light, a reminder that, despite everything, I still had value, I was still loved, and my story wouldn't end there. And it was from this new understanding that I began to discover who I truly was, beyond the pain and beyond being a betrayed wife. Because the next step on my journey would be to face the question I'd been avoiding. Who am I when everything that had defined my life until now has been ripped away from me? It was in this process of seeing the truth behind the pain that something inside me began to awaken. For so long, I had defined myself by the roles I played: wife, friend, faithful servant in the church. And when these roles crumbled, I found myself facing a void, almost as if there was nothing left in me but the wound I carried. But little by little, I began to realize that this void wasn't the end, but a space where God was inviting me to discover who I truly was. Not just the woman marked by betrayal, not just the one who was silenced, but someone with a deeper identity, one that couldn't be erased by other people's choices. This revelation was like a key turning inside me. I understood that I wasn't defined by the betrayed wife, nor by the embarrassed woman who had to hide tears behind a smile. My true identity lay in something greater, something no one could steal. I was a beloved daughter of God. This awareness didn't come all at once, like a sudden flash, but as a delicate, almost artisanal process in which each day I discovered a new layer of my worth. It was like rebuilding a mosaic, piece by piece, only this time without the rush to please or meet others' expectations, but rather with the serenity of someone who recognizes that their essence is immutable. My mindset began to shift when I realized that everything that had been ripped away from me wasn't, in fact, the foundation of my life. The title of wife, the accolades for being a strong woman in faith, the appearance of perfection before the community. None of it supported who I truly was. These were mere shells, roles in a play I was playing. And behind the scenes of this pain lay a much deeper revelation. My worth didn't depend on performance, nor on approval, nor on someone choosing me to be with them. The impact of this realization was liberating because it freed me from an invisible prison. I began to see that even at the moment I felt most rejected, I was still chosen, not by a man, not by an institution, but by the Creator himself. And it was this certainty that ignited a new kind of strength within me, a strength that didn't depend on applause, but rather arose from the silent conviction of being a daughter, of being loved unconditionally. This changed everything, the way I looked in the mirror, the way I interpreted my scars, and even the weight of the history I carried. It was no longer about shame, but about transformation. The identity I was rediscovering freed me from the burden of having to prove myself to the world. I no longer needed to disguise my pain to appear strong, because true strength lay precisely in recognizing my fragility before God. This journey showed me that pain can steal roles, but it can never steal essence. And it was when I began to truly believe this that inner reconstruction became possible, opening the space for me to take the next step, learning to transform this new awareness into choices that reflected who I truly was, without masks and without fear. Recognizing who I truly was before God brought new light, but it didn't immediately erase the shadows that still haunted me, because while I no longer saw myself as the rejected and diminished woman, on the other hand, there still existed a silent battle that seemed impossible to win, the struggle to forgive. Within me, feelings coexisted, crashing like waves against rocks. There were days when the hurt seemed stronger, others when hatred spoke louder, and there were countless moments when the desire for revenge made me imagine scenes of humiliation where he would experience the pain I had felt. It was as if my mind were a battlefield, where I constantly had to decide whether to feed my anger or allow peace to flourish. Forgiveness didn't come like a magic button I could press. It proved to be a slow, often painful process, because it required me to give up something that, in some ways, gave me a sense of power, the right to take revenge, the right to exact justice, the right to take justice into my own hands. But at the same time, I realized that this supposed strength was actually a prison. The hatred I harbored not only hurt the person who had hurt me, but kept me chained to it. It was like carrying invisible chains that prevented me from moving forward, as if my story were eternally trapped in the past. It was at this point that I began to understand the hidden truth behind forgiveness. It wasn't about forgetting what happened, nor about absolving those who hurt me of the consequences of their choices. Forgiveness was, above all, an act of freedom for myself. It was the chance to release the weight that crushed me and choose to live without carrying baggage that was no longer mine. This revelation, however, didn't eliminate the struggle. Every decision to forgive seemed to be tested the next day, when memories returned, or when the pain throbbed in some unexpected detail. I needed to shift my mindset and see that forgiveness wasn't an emotion, but an ongoing decision. It was like a seed that needed to be watered every day, even when the ground seemed dry. Sometimes my prayer was just a whisper, "God, I want to forgive, but I can't." And in this sincere dialogue, I realized that he didn't require perfection, but willingness. It was this movement, however fragile, that gradually opened the way for transformation. And the more I chose to forgive, the more I realized the impact of that choice within me. Hatred lost its strength, hurt no longer defined my steps, and even thoughts of revenge began to dissolve. It was like wiping a cloudy lens and finally seeing life clearly. This journey didn't make me forget the pain, but it taught me that there's a difference between carrying scars and living chained to open wounds. A scar is proof of survival, but an open wound is a sign of imprisonment. And it was when I truly decided I no longer wanted to be held hostage by the past that something new began to stir within me, paving the way for the next step of my journey. Realizing that forgiveness was beginning to blossom within me was like breathing new air after so long of suffocation. And little by little, I began to understand that those wounds wouldn't simply disappear, but would transform into something else, scars. And scars carry a hidden truth that we're not always ready to accept. They're not marks of defeat, but silent testimonies of survival. Each one told a story of falling, but also of rising again, of tears that once drowned me, but today reminded me that I wasn't forever submerged. It was at this point in my journey that I understood the impact of my own pain. It wasn't in vain. Those experiences, cruel as they seemed, were teaching me lessons I never would have learned in the shadows of a quiet life. It was rejection that taught me the importance of trusting God first and myself second. It was disappointment that showed me the boundaries I needed to set to prevent others from overstepping the boundaries of my worth. It was the feeling of abandonment that made me rediscover how solid my identity was, even when everything around me seemed to be crumbling. These revelations didn't come all at once. They were like flashes of light that emerged midway through the journey, small insights that, when combined, revealed a bigger picture. And within that picture was a truth I needed to face. Pain, though devastating, can become a relentless but fair teacher. It reveals our weaknesses, but it also points to areas where hidden strength lies. And when we look honestly, we see that each healed wound shapes us, sharpens us, and prepares us for new decisions. I learned, for example, that trust doesn't mean blindly surrendering yourself to just anyone, but rather choosing wisely who to trust. I learned that boundaries aren't walls that isolate, but gates that protect. And I learned that my self-worth isn't measured by the gaze of someone who rejects me, but by the inner recognition of who I am, and by the unwavering love of God, who has always been with me, even when I didn't realize it. These lessons weren't just theoretical, but engraved in me with the strength of someone who lived and survived. And when I began to view my scars with this mindset, something changed from the inside out. Instead of hiding my marks, I began to recognize them as part of my journey. They were proof that I had weathered storms that could have destroyed me, but instead made me more aware of my worth. This awareness didn't eliminate all the pain of the past, but it gave me a new perspective. Instead of feeling ashamed, I now perceived a kind of honor in bearing marks that showed I hadn't just fallen, but had also risen. It was at this point that I understood that my life didn't need to be defined by the wounds I'd received, but by the strength I'd gained from surviving them. And this revelation opened the door to something even more profound, a realization that would continue to transform not only how I viewed the past, but also how I would face what was yet to come. Recognizing the scars as part of my story was only the beginning, because later came the need to rebuild what had been shattered within me. It wasn't just about enduring the pain, but about finding a real path to restoration. It was at that point that I realized that emotional reconstruction doesn't happen by accident. It requires conscious choices, firm decisions, and a mindset prepared to dive into processes that often aren't immediate. I had to face head-on that I couldn't put all the pieces back together alone, and accepting this was a step of courage, not weakness. Seeking help became essential. Therapy opened a space for me to express words that had previously been stifled within me. It was as if each session lifted an invisible weight I carried deep within my soul. There, I understood that I wasn't condemned to repeat patterns, that pain didn't need to dictate the pace of my next steps. Support groups, in turn, showed me the power of community. Hearing stories from others who also carried their scars made me see that there was hope, that no one was alone on this journey. There was something powerful in the simple act of sharing, because with each revelation of vulnerability, a piece of healing also emerged. But it was in spirituality that I found an unshakable foundation. Prayer, which had previously seemed silent and unanswered, became an intimate dialogue, a space where I could pour out my soul and find solace. Fasting, in turn, was not just a religious practice, but an exercise in discipline and surrender that strengthened my mindset and reconnected me with the purpose I had lost sight of. These practices didn't magically eliminate suffering, but they created a solid foundation for transformation to begin happening from the inside out. And each of these pillars, therapy, support, prayer, and fasting, intertwined in an ongoing process of restoration. It wasn't linear, there wasn't a straight line without setbacks, but rather a journey marked by ups and downs, small victories, and new beginnings. With each step, however, I felt I was rebuilding something greater than I had before, a version of myself that was more conscious, stronger, and better prepared to face life's impacts without losing my essence. It was as if I were building a house on new foundations, this time firmer, deeper, and more resilient to the storms that would inevitably come. This reconstruction didn't erase the past, but it helped me look at it without fear. The practices became anchors, reminding me that even when my mind wavered or my heart seemed to give way, there were resources and paths that kept me steady. And this security opened a new space, fertile ground where other revelations began to blossom, showing that the healing journey, more than a destination, is an ongoing process of transformation. After building the first pillars of this reconstruction, something unexpected began to emerge: the fear of starting over. It didn't appear loudly, but in constant whispers, questioning whether I was truly ready to make room for the new. It was the kind of insecurity that infiltrates the back of the mind, raising cruel doubts about love, respect, and worth. I wondered if anyone would ever see me beyond my scars, if what remained of me was still enough to deserve trust, or if I was destined to forever live with the shadow of what had happened. This was one of the greatest challenges, facing the hidden truth that even after so much transformation, vulnerability still had the power to paralyze. Fear had many faces. Sometimes it manifested as distrust, other times as the feeling of not deserving another chance. It was a silent battleground between the scars of the past and faith in the future. And in a way, this conflict revealed something profound. It wasn't just about believing in other people, but about believing that God still had a story written for me that didn't end with that pain. The impact of this understanding was liberating, because it showed me that I didn't need to wait for external guarantees to start over. The true starting point was within me, in the decision to walk even without all the answers. Facing this fear required a new mindset. I needed to remind myself that faith isn't the absence of doubts, but the courage to move forward despite them. And it was in this movement that I realized how every prayer, every silent tear shed, and every small victory in the process of restoration was preparing me for this moment. The new beginning didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to be genuine. It was about taking steps of trust, even if shaky, and believing that God's love not only sustained me, but also empowered me to believe again in life, in people, and in myself. This internal struggle taught me that the most powerful revelations often happen amidst the chaos of emotions. Because when fear told me I would never be loved again, faith responded that God's love already defined me. When insecurity screamed that respect was something distant, the certainty of my renewed identity reminded me that I didn't need to bend to be accepted. These truths became anchors amidst the storms, bringing clarity to see beyond the wounds. And it was precisely in this tension between fragility and courage that I began to realize that starting over wasn't a final destination, but part of a journey in constant movement. It required daily choices, continuous surrender, and the willingness to move forward even without seeing the whole picture ahead. This realization brought an unexpected peace because it showed me that it wasn't about controlling the future, but about trusting that, step by step, I would be guided. And in this process, a new horizon began to take shape. paving the way for experiences that would go beyond anything I could have imagined. It was in this process of facing my own fears that a new understanding began to dawn within me, a vision of what family truly means. For a long time, I associated this concept only with the obvious: blood ties, marriage, a shared home. But when all of that fell apart, when the roles I so fiercely defended were torn apart before my eyes, I realized there was a hidden truth I had never experienced so clearly. Family wasn't just what was built around formal bonds or social expectations, but also an invisible network of care, support, and love that emerged from the most unexpected places. It was behind the scenes of pain that I saw this revelation. People who had no obligation to remain by my side chose to stay. Friends I thought distant became brothers and sisters on the journey, offering words of encouragement in moments when silence weighed more heavily than anything. Men and women from the faith community reached out with simple yet powerful gestures: a heartfelt prayer, an unexpected visit, a message sent at the precise moment despair threatened to overtake them. And there lay what I needed to learn: that family is also formed by those who choose to walk with us, even without sharing the same last name. This shift in mindset opened the door to profound healing, breaking the pattern that had led me to believe I had lost everything. Instead, I realized that, amidst the losses, God was revealing to me a model of family that went beyond anything I could have imagined. A brotherhood in Christ that transcends barriers, embraces weaknesses, and, at the same time, encourages us to grow. This understanding was like seeing life through a new lens, where each relationship becomes an opportunity for learning, transformation, and sharing. The journey thus far has shown me that the true essence of family lies not only in physical proximity, but in the constant choice to love, to reach out, to bear each other's burdens. This discovery brought me peace, because it meant I no longer needed to live in the prison of isolation or longing for what was never again. On the contrary, it was the chance to experience a broader communion, where respect and love became the strongest and most enduring bonds. And as this new vision took hold within me, something even greater began to take shape on the horizon, as if each step of this reconstruction opened up space to understand that, behind the losses, there was a preparation for something deeper and more transformative, something that would go beyond the concept of family and reach the true sense of belonging. When the awareness of this greater calling settled within me, I realized that nothing I experienced could be wasted. Every tear, every forced silence, every night when anguish seemed to suffocate me, had a purpose that now revealed itself before my eyes. The pain, once so heavy, began to take on new meaning. It transformed into a tool of healing, not only for me, but for so many other women who needed a voice to echo what they couldn't express. It was as if the backstage of my own story became a stage for revelations, where vulnerability was no longer shame, but strength. And it was in this process that I discovered something powerful. Sharing isn't just about narrating facts. It's about opening up space for others to see themselves reflected in our failures and our victories. Each time I shared my experience, I realized an invisible bridge was emerging, a connection capable of spanning pain, realities, and distances. This impact, as profound as it was unexpected, showed me that testimonies have the power to awaken mindsets, to shatter hidden lies, to restore dignity to those who believed they no longer had value. It's not about seeking applause or recognition, but about accepting that personal transformation gains real meaning when it becomes collective transformation. And it's at this point that everything aligns. Our stories aren't isolated. They intertwine in a vast network of human experiences that remind us that no one needs to carry the seemingly unbearable burdens alone. So, if this story resonated with you, share it in the comments. Share your experience or send this video to someone who needs to hear that they're not alone. Every word can be the key to freeing someone from a silence that imprisons. And if you want to hear more real stories that have the power to transform lives, subscribe to the channel and be part of this journey. Here, every scar finds greater meaning, and every voice that rises strengthens the other, creating a space of truth and hope that only grows when we walk together.